Tweets ignite society. Statuses begin battles. Everyone has an opinion. No one wants to surrender. We bring the cold hard facts. We are calling for a ceasefire.
Hello. We've been hearing back and forth about the mortality rates over the years and comparing 2020 to previous years and how the mortality rate hasn't been increased, and then there are people on the other side saying it has increased, it has to have increased, it must have increased. So we thought we'd take a look at the details and see what we can find, provide information for you to make your own decision. So let's dive into it. For those of you who want to just get to the point, here is the summary of our findings. In order to do a fair comparison from year to year, we have to factor in the population. In order to do that, we are going to look at the percentage of our population who died. In comparing the influenza deaths from 2010, 0.0196% of our population died from influenza. 0.012% more than died in 2019-20. This tends to be a bit skewed though, because in April of 2020, influenza was not tracked anymore. According to death certificates, looking at the weeks with the highest death due to pneumonia, influenza, and COVID-19, 0.065% of our population died from pneumonia and influenza in 2018 in week 2. In 2015, 0.061% also died in week 2. And in week 52 of 2017, 0.59% died. Keep in mind, those were only from pneumonia and influenza, because COVID didn't exist yet. In comparison, in week 15 of 2020, 0.060% died of pneumonia, influenza, COVID-19. So in the weekly comparison, there was an insignificant difference in the top 4 weeks of death due to pneumonia, influenza, and COVID-19. For total deaths for the year, 2.784% of our population in 2020 died in comparison to 2.67% in 2018 and 2.652% in 2019. So although more deaths occurred in 2020, it was 0.0114% more than the next highest year of 2018. Let's take a look at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. This is their influenza information center where they look at past seasons and the estimated influenza disease burden. They break things out by symptomatic illnesses, medical visits, hospitalization, and deaths. So since 2010, if we just scan down through, it looks like 2011, 2012 was a pretty light year. You can see that we had a lot of hospitalizations in 2012, 2013. And then if you go over here to deaths, you can scan down through and see that our deaths, although they were pretty high at 43,000 in 2012, 2013, it was 51,000 in 2014, 2015. So these deaths, they happen every year. They're from the flu. We don't know about them. Nobody really reports them. You definitely would know if you had lost someone to the flu, but outside of that, you would never know. So if we can move down here, these are considered preliminary numbers. I have no idea why they would have preliminary numbers clear back to 2017, but they do. So if we look, 2017-18 was supposed to have been a really bad year for flu, and we can see that by the symptomatic illnesses column. We can see that by the medical visits, and we can see that by the hospitalizations. Now that's a lot of people in the hospital for the flu. And we can see that the death rate was 61,000. That's 10,000 more than it was in 2014 and 15. So if we look back outside of this year that seems to have an anomaly to it, we can see that, it's in the 30,000 range, except for this year where it was 23,000 that died. You can also see that it, as the number of people who have symptomatic illnesses goes up, so do the other numbers. So let's look back here, and again, remember, these are preliminary numbers down here. But we went from 61,000 in 2017 of people dying to 34,000. So if you look up here and you see this large number of people who were sick, they went to the doctors, some ended up in the hospital, and 43,000 died. Here we see a lot of people were sick, they went to their doctor, they end up in the hospital, and 61,000 died. So you see the numbers. In 2018-19, you had people who were sick, they went to their doctors, they went to the hospital, and these are the ones that died. Now we look at 2019, 2020, we have people who felt sick, which was less than the people who felt sick in 2017. People went to the doctor, less people went to the doctor in 2007 than in 2017. People were in the hospital. If you notice, it was half the number were in the hospital from 2017. And now we have 22,000 people died of flu, which is like 1/3 the number who died in 2017. So I guess if we want to estimate, we would figure that the extra deaths from 2020 would have been from COVID and not from flu. But we had these large numbers back in 2017, 2018 that we knew nothing about. So you can see they tell us that we can click to find out how they estimate all these numbers and the burden. If we flip over there, we come to a point where it says, why doesn't the CDC base its seasonal flu mortality estimates only on death certificates that specifically list influenza? So they're saying they don't do that because there can be comoralities. So those numbers are not based on death certificates. The CDC numbers for the flu are not based only on death certificates. So if we switch over here to where it talks about the 2019-2020 preliminary in-season burden estimates, we find out that they stopped doing this in April of 2020. That was the last week in the season preliminary burden estimates. Because the estimates below are not the final numbers. And they updated this December 3rd of 2020 and said that the model used to generate influenza in-season preliminary burden estimates uses current season flu hospitalization data. This is where it sits. However, the National Center for Health Statistics, they've continued to track the flu, and they've included pneumonia, flu, and COVID as well. So we're going to take a look at the CDC data for the weekly counts of death by jurisdiction and cause of death. We weren't able to get anything from this site prior to 2015, so we found another site that did, this macrotrends.net site, and they show the United States. This is from 2000 to 2016. This is the overall mortality rate. On the bottom you can see the percent of change from the previous year, and on the top you can see the deaths per 100,000 people. You can see where it took a drop in 2004. Interestingly enough, in 2004 was when SARS-CoV-1 hit. Now, thankfully, the United States wasn't hit too hard, but it's interesting that our death rate dropped in 2004 and continued to drop until 2008. In 2008, there was an increase by 1% between 2008 and 2009. Now again, you can see this number doesn't look very big, but if you go down here, you can see the significant jump to more people dying. It stayed the same until 2013. So why did it jump so much from 2008 to 2009 by 1%? H1N1. The H1N1 swine flu epidemic hit in 2009. We can go over and pull up the National Center for Health Statistics. We can see the causes of deaths, and we can see that heart disease went down, cancer went down a little bit, stroke went down, but the chronic lower respiratory disease went up. So that would account for this increase in mortality. So then we go along and it's pretty level for a while until we hit 2013 and 2014, and we have about a 3.3% increase. So what happened in 2014? Pull up that same brief for 2014. It tells us that there was an increase of unintentional injuries, stroke, Alzheimer's, and suicide. Alzheimer's increased by 8%. And then it kind of levels off as far as each year, the percentage of change, but you can see that the number of people dying has increased. So now we can come back to our chart that we were going to look at from 2015 on for the weekly counts of death by jurisdiction and cause of death. So here we are looking at a graphic representation of the information downloaded directly from the CDC website. We're not going to really count in the 2021 information because it's still fairly new and could possibly change, but we can look at the rest of these. So what I want you to notice is that in these numbers is 2020. You can see where there was a significant increase of deaths in 2020 back here. It's hard to, on week 15, but in general, it's not like it was a significantly high increase. I mean, if you want to look here, back here at 2016, comparing 2016 to 2018, there was a significant increase, and that was only 2 years. 2017 is here, and here's the increase between 2018 and 2017. 2019 compared to 2020. 2018 compared to 2017. So you can see we've had times when the number of mortality has increased in the United States significantly. Here's 2017 compared to 2016. And you can also see that in 2018, we had a significant increase than we've ever had, even more than the number that died in 2020. So what was that caused by? What's really cool about, I'm using Power BI by Microsoft, where I imported the data. What's cool, you can pick 2020 and you can ask, why did this increase here? What's the increase between week 14 and week 15? And if we click here, we can say analyze and explain the increase. And it looks at the data that was exported and gives you an idea of why it increased from 2014, or from the 2020 week 14 to 2020 week 15. Interesting enough, when we do that, it tells us that heart disease and Alzheimer's accounted for the majority of the increase. So if you look down here, you can see the majority of the increase. Here's influenza and pneumonia, and here's other. None of these say COVID, but let's just say it's somewhere in these numbers. But yet, here's heart disease, and here's Alzheimer's. So you can see that the increase here that we're seeing in mortality is not necessarily due to COVID. It's possible those people died with COVID. So if we're comparing 2019 to 2020, we see we were tracking right along. until about week 12, which was about March 16th, March 20th, around that time. We hit a peak at week 15, and then we leveled back off and became pretty close. Well, we were right on with 2019. We separated just a little bit here around June. We started separating. We're a little higher than normal. And then we leveled back off here week 42, which was October. And now we're tracking right on with 2019. So if we compare 2018 to 2020, we can see that 2018 we had significant increase in mortality over 2020, and then it just dropped, leveled off, and swung back up. So you see there is a pattern here as well. You see the pattern of everything's in the beginning of the year it's pretty high, and then it swings back down and then swings back up. So if you look at 2020, there were a few months there that we really were probably hit with COVID. We didn't know what to do, we didn't know how to treat it, so the numbers increased. But in general, the swing, was not significant. There wasn't a significant difference. It looks like the numbers are between 10 and 15,000 more people than normal. Not hundreds of thousands. Here's, let's see, the biggest difference from 2018 is we're looking at, 153,000 and 168,000. 2018, 171,000 to 198,000. So nowhere during our time was there more than maybe 20,000 more people than it typically would happen in a year. In 2018, we had 213,000 people die. Let's see, we had 153,000 in 2021. That's where it sits right now. 187,000 in 2020. 181,000 in 2019. With 213,000 in 2018. Well over 20,000 more people. You can generally see these are the mortality numbers since 2015. You can see what 2020 looks like compared to it. So if we look at the National Center for Health Statistics, they said from 2017 to 2018, they said the rate increased 4.2% for influenza and pneumonia and 1.4% for suicides. That's supposed to account for the extra number of deaths for 2018. Let's take a look at a few more of these little spikes that we had. So let's see what the significant drop was. Disease, influenza, pneumonia, and malignant neoplasms accounted for the majority of the decrease. So here's influenza, here's other. I don't know what's included in other. Here to see what the increase was. Malignant neoplasm, hypertensive disease accounted for the majority of the increase. Let's see. Alzheimer's, dementia, influenza, pneumonia, cerebral vascular disease accounted for the increase. Here's our other. Let's see if we can look at 2018 and see what that was all about. Alzheimer's, dementia, and respiratory disease. Respiratory disease. Large number of other there. Let's see what that increase was. Alzheimer's, dementia, malignant neoplasms, and heart disease. So it seems like they account for a lot. Here's an other here though. But in general, it doesn't. We just had a couple little peaks in 2020. Again, nothing as significant as the peak in 2018. which seems to have happened all over the country. We did a little Googling and found out that in the first quarter of 2018, a lot of countries noted that there was a significant increase in their mortality rates, but no one ever said why. So let's take a look at this page. This is the Pneumonia and Influenza Mortality Surveillance from the National Center of Health Statistics Mortality Service System. What a name, huh? Anyway, before we start diving into the information on this website, you can click on the help page, which will give you a quick reference guide to what we're looking at. And I wanted to point out a few things in that regard. On this help page, they tell us that they provide an overview of pneumonia, influenza, and COVID-19 mortality surveillance data from the National Center of Health Statistics Mortality Surveillance System. The system has been in place for years. You can go back a long way on it. They also tell us that pneumonia and or influenza, which is typically referred to as P&I, deaths and pneumonia, influenza and or COVID-19, which they indicate as PIC, deaths, are identified based on the ICD-10 multiple cause of death codes. So in other words, they're actually looking at death certificates and looking at how they were coded. The data is presented by the week that the death occurred. So it wouldn't. So if someone died a week ago, they're not going to show up in this week's death count. So it's a more accurate look as to what's really going on, especially with COVID. Not all deaths are reported within a week of death. Therefore, data for earlier weeks are continually revised. So in other words, if someone died 2 months ago and they're just now looking at their death certificate, that person will be counted in the numbers from 2 months ago. So the historic data is going to be pretty accurate. Now, if we want to know what happened last week or the week before, we may not get the most accurate data. But we're just going to be looking at an overall look at numbers for the year. Death counts reported by the NCHS includes deaths that have COVID-19 listed as a cause of death and may include laboratory confirmed deaths and clinically confirmed deaths. So one thing to keep in mind though is that again they put in provisional numbers for 2 months ago. They put in a provisional number, and then as they go through and read the death certificate, they'll go back and change that number. So again, unless we're going to be looking at the previous 2 weeks, our numbers are still going to be fairly accurate because we're looking back at the past. So on this website right now, we've picked pneumonia, influenza, and COVID-19. So these numbers are going to include the COVID-19. So when we look at this over here is just a picture of the state. And as you change the weeks, it will go back and show you the status of what the states look like. If it was a normal level, it'd be green, but it's above the threshold. The threshold is right here. You can see this dark black line is the threshold of what they expect. And you can see where typically pneumonia and influenza did a curve. It would be up and down throughout the year. We have turned on the number of influenza deaths and the COVID deaths. So if you look down here, you'll see where the influenza would kick in. And it would peak, and then it would go down. And then it would be gone for a while, and then it would peak, and then it would go down. And that's where we get our flu seasons. You can see here that rolling, it usually starts around week 51, near the end of the year, like week 51, and goes till week 18. So we've been past week 51, which would have been last year, 2020, and we don't see that showing up here right now. So we don't see that bump However, that bump could show up once they've reviewed all of the death certificates and make their adjustments accordingly. So what we're looking at here is everything from 2016 to 2021. You can definitely see there was a change. And if you look down here, percent of deaths due to PIC. Remember, PIC stood for pneumonia, influenza, and COVID. So they've included COVID in that number. So you can see this red line go up. It's interesting that back here in 2017, 2018, there was a big bump. And if you look here, the bump went up pretty high. But if you look at this percent of death, we went from a 12% death in 2017, which no one even knew about, to a 28% in 33.5 compared to 27.7 compared to 10.9%. So if we're looking over here at this is the 2021 period. In week 1 it was pretty high. So if we go over to this, we can change this to look at week 1. See how it says week 1? And then we can go down here and look at week 1 compared to week 53, week 52. So I want to remember those numbers. Let's look back at week 3 of 2017, 2018. It's 2017, 2018, and we wanted to go to week 3. So you can see these numbers now. Take a look at the difference in the numbers. Well, here we have the total deaths. The total deaths right here. So if we look at what our week 1, which was on that chart, looked like the worst of COVID, we had death rates at about 79,000 between week 53 and week 1. If we look back at 2017, at the worst weeks during that flu epidemic, we see that we had 67,000 deaths. So when we're looking at the two of these, it's an increase of about 12,000 deaths overall, the entire United States, between the flu epidemic that happened in 2017 and the COVID epidemic that happened, well, that's happening right now. Okay, so now we're going to remember these numbers, and let's go back to 2020, 2021, and let's take a look, and let's say the worst that we had was back on week 16, and we'll take a look at these numbers, and let's pull up 2017, 2018 numbers. So in 2017-18, again, we had the 67,000 at the worst point. We started freaking out about COVID, and the worst case prior to what we just went through here in 2021, the end of 2020, we had 78,000. So again, we're looking at maybe 10,000 more deaths, 11,000 more deaths than we had in 2017. The difference between this bump and this bump and this bump is about 10,000 more deaths. There you have it. We hope this has provided you with the information you need to decide how much COVID has affected the mortality numbers of the United States. Links are included below. Please share this information with both those you agree with and those you disagree with. Thank you for joining us for this ceasefire moment.